All right, so picture this. You're walking home after a night out, and suddenly you see three guys beating up someone in an alley.
Oh, wow.
Do you jump in, risking your own safety, or keep walking?
That's,
It's a tough one, right?
it is a tough one.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really makes you think about, like, what would you do in that situation? It's like that immediate gut reaction of, like, do you step in and help, or do you kind of, like, weigh the potential consequences?
Exactly. And to really wrestle with that question, we're going to turn to, well, some of history's greatest minds.
Yeah.
Today, we're going to see how four philosophical heavyweights, Aristotle, Mill, Kant, and Nietzsche, might approach this ethical dilemma.
I'm excited for this one.
Yeah.
This is going to be good.
Okay, let's start with Aristotle. Now, I always think of him as like the virtue ethics guy.
He is. He is. Aristotle believed that living a good life is all about cultivating virtuous character traits. Things like courage, justice, compassion, and even prudence.
So in this alleyway situation, would Aristotle say we have like a duty to intervene based on those virtues?
He might. He might, but it's not a simple yes or no. Remember, for Aristotle, it's not just about blindly rushing in. It's about acting virtuously,
Right.
but also wisely.
So what would that look like in this case?
Well, imagine charging into a fight where the attackers are armed.
Yeah.
That might appear courageous, but it's not very prudent.
Yeah.
Aristotle would say that true courage involves assessing the situation, considering the potential consequences, and then acting in a way that aligns with both your values and your reason.
Makes sense. So it's about finding that balance between like bravery and practicality. That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so we've got Aristotle encouraging us to kind of tap into our inner hero, but also to use our heads. Now let's shift gears to John Stuart Mill and the utilitarians. They're all about the greatest good for the greatest number, right?
Exactly. Mill would approach this scenario like a complex equation, weighing the potential benefits and harms of each possible action.
So walk me through that calculation. What factors would a utilitarian consider?
Okay, so, well, first, they'd look at the potential benefits of intervening. You might save the victim from serious injury or maybe even deter future violence.
Okay.
Then they'd weigh those benefits against the potential risks.
Right.
Could intervening put you in danger? Could it make the situation worse?
It sounds like they'd also have to think about like the long-term consequences, not just the immediate aftermath.
Absolutely. A utilitarian would consider the ripple effects. Does intervening set a positive example that might discourage violence in the community, or could it create a climate of fear where people are less likely to help others in the future? It's a lot to think about.
Yeah, it really is. So with all those factors in play, how would a utilitarian ultimately decide whether to step in or not?
They'd go with the option that seems to produce the greatest overall happiness and the least suffering for everyone involved. But here's a key insight. Even utilitarians recognize that individual rights matter. They wouldn't condone actions that violate basic rights, even if those actions might seem to benefit the majority in the short term.
So even the cold, calculating utilitarians have their limits.
Yes.
That's good to know. All right, on to our next philosophical contender, Immanuel Kant. He's the duty and principles guy, right?
That's right. Kant believed in following moral principles,
Right.
regardless of the consequences. His famous categorical imperative asks, what if everyone did this? It's a test of universalizability.
Okay, so how would Kant approach our street fight scenario?
He'd say that if intervening to help someone in need is the right thing to do, then it should apply universally, no exceptions. It becomes a moral duty regardless of the potential risks or outcomes.
So it's not about whether it's convenient or safe for you in that particular moment. It's about upholding a principle that you believe should always hold true.
Exactly. For Kant, respecting human dignity is a fundamental principle.
Yeah.
Helping the victim upholds their inherent worth as a person. And here's the key difference between Kant and Mill. Kant emphasizes intentions over outcomes. Doing the right thing is what matters, even if it doesn't work out as planned.
That's a really interesting contrast. Okay, we've covered Aristotle with his focus on virtuous action, Mill with his utilitarian calculations, and Kant with his emphasis on moral duty. Now let's bring in the wild card. Friedrich Nietzsche. He always shakes things up. What would he have to say about our street fight?
Nietzsche was all about the will to power, the drive to assert oneself and shape the world according to one's own values. He might see intervening in the fight as an expression of strength, a way of taking control of a chaotic situation.
So it's not about some sense of duty or altruism, but more about proving your own power and dominance.
It's more nuanced than that. Nietzsche wouldn't necessarily endorse cruelty or exploitation. He'd be asking you, are your actions a genuine expression of your will, or are you just reacting to societal pressure?
So instead of asking what's the right thing to do, Nietzsche might ask, does intervening align with your personal values and help you grow as an individual?
Exactly. He's less interested in universal moral principles and more focused on your individual journey of self-discovery and empowerment.
Wow. It's amazing to see how differently those four philosophers approach the same ethical dilemma. We've got Aristotle emphasizing virtue, Mill crunching the numbers, Kant laying down the law, and Nietzsche kind of questioning everything. It's like they're having their own philosophical street fight.
It is. And while each of these perspectives offers valuable insights, it's also important to recognize that no philosophical system is perfect. They all have their limitations.
Okay, let's unpack that a bit. Where do the cracks start to show with each of them?
Well, let's start with Aristotle. Virtue ethics can be a bit vague when it comes to specific guidings. What exactly does it mean to be courageous or prudent in a given situation? It's open to interpretation.
Yeah, what seems courageous to one person could seem reckless to another, and Aristotle doesn't really give us a formula for figuring that out.
Exactly. He relies on us developing good judgment, which can be a lifelong process. Plus, different cultures and societies might have different ideas about what virtues are most important.
That's true. Okay, so virtue ethics doesn't always give us clear-cut answers. What about utilitarianism? I can already see some potential downsides to focusing solely on the greatest good for the greatest number.
Yeah, you're right to be cautious. One major criticism of utilitarianism is that it can be hard to predict the consequences of our actions accurately. We might think we're doing what will lead to the best outcome, but, unintended consequences can always pop up.
It's like that saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Yeah.
Exactly. And utilitarianism can also be criticized for potentially sacrificing the rights of the individual for the sake of the majority. Think about it. If an action benefits a large group of people but severely harms a smaller group, a strict utilitarian might argue that it's justified.
Yeah, that raises some red flags for sure. It's like the classic trolley problem. Do you sacrifice one life to save five?
Precisely. Utilitarianism can lead to some very tricky ethical dilemmas.
All right, so we've got some potential issues with Aristotle's virtue ethics and Mill's utilitarianism. What about Kant? He seems pretty strict with his emphasis on moral duty.
He is. One criticism of Kant is that his categorical imperative can be quite rigid. It doesn't always allow for exceptions or take into account the nuances of real-life situations.
So in our street fight scenario, Kant might say you have a duty to intervene even if it puts you, in serious danger.
He might. And while that unwavering commitment to principle is admirable, it's not always practical. Plus, life is rarely black and white. Sometimes we have multiple moral duties that clash, and Kant doesn't offer a clear way to prioritize them.
Good point. Okay, finally, let's talk about Nietzsche. His ideas are already pretty controversial, so I'm guessing there's a lot of pushback.
There is. One common criticism is that Nietzsche's focus on the will to power can be misinterpreted as a justification for selfish or even cruel behavior.
Right, it can sound like you saying might makes right.
And while Nietzsche definitely challenged conventional morality, he wasn't advocating for a chaotic free-for-all. He believed that creating your own values requires discipline, self-awareness, and a commitment to personal growth.
So it's not just about dominating others. It's about mastering yourself and living authentically.
Exactly. But it's easy to see how Nietzsche's ideas can be misunderstood or taken out of context.
So we've explored the strengths and weaknesses of these four philosophical giants. I think it's safe to say there's no single perfect answer to our ethical dilemma of whether to intervene or not.
And that's okay. Philosophy isn't about finding the right answer. It's about giving you tools to think critically and make informed decisions. It's like having a toolbox filled with different philosophical axes. And you can choose which one best helps you understand a particular situation.
I like that analogy. The more we kind of engage with these different perspectives, the more nuanced and insightful our own ethical decision-making becomes.
It's like a mental workout for your moral compass.
I love it. So where do we go from here? We've looked at these different approaches, we've considered their limitations, but we still haven't really definitively answered the question. What should you do in that alleyway?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? In the final part of our deep dive, we'll step back and look at the bigger picture. What does it all mean for living an ethical life when there are no easy answers?
I'm ready. It feels like we've been wrestling with these philosophical dilemmas, and I'm curious to see where it all leads. Welcome back to the Deep Dive. After hearing from all those like philosophical heavy hitters, Aristotle, Mill, Kant, and Nietzsche, my head is spinning a little bit.
Oh, yeah.
It's incredible how differently they approach the same ethical dilemma.
It is. It really is.
Yeah.
And as we've explored, each of their perspectives has strengths and weaknesses.
Right.
There's no one right answer to the question of whether to intervene in a street fight or not.
Exactly. But even without like a clear-cut answer, I
Yeah.
feel like we've gained some really valuable tools for navigating these kinds of tough choices in real life.
For sure.
Yeah.
That's the key takeaway here, right?
Yeah.
Philosophy isn't about giving you a rule book for life. It's about helping you develop your own moral compass and make informed decisions.
So if we kind of step back and look at the bigger picture, what does it all mean for living an ethical life? Especially in a world where, let's face it, there are no easy answers.
It means recognizing that ethics are complex.
Yeah.
We might find ourselves drawn to different philosophical approaches depending on the situation.
Yeah.
Sometimes we might prioritize virtues,
Okay.
sometimes consequences, sometimes duties,
Yeah.
and sometimes our own personal growth.
It's like we've got this whole arsenal of ethical tools at our disposal.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
And the more we engage with these different tools, the more we strengthen our, ethical muscles, so to speak.
Ooh, I like that.
Yeah.
I like that analogy. So even though this deep dive started with a pretty intense scenario, witnessing a street fight,
Right.
it ultimately kind of comes down to personal growth
Yeah.
and developing that ethical fitness.
Absolutely. And remember, the journey doesn't end here, right? Every day presents us with opportunities to flex those ethical muscles and make choices that align with our values.
I love that. I think that's a great note to kind of wrap up on. So to our listeners, the next time you find yourself facing a tough choice, remember those four philosophers. Think about their different perspectives and what they might say.
Yeah, yeah. And most importantly, trust yourself and your own evolving moral compass.
Yeah. Because at the end of the day, the most important question isn't what would Aristotle do?
Exactly.
It's what will you do?
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into ethical decision-making.